We often debate education policy through the lens of funding, but are we missing something that actually has a huge impact on education outcomes for our kids?
We do need to have the parents' interests first and foremost in how we are providing those services to a child.
On this episode, we sit down with the governor's new education advisor to discuss how to elevate the parent-teacher partnership and make it easier for parents to engage in the classroom. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about education, specifically what will the education vision for Utah be in the coming years. And I'm pleased to be joined in studio by Dr. Rich Nye, who's the Senior Advisor of Education to Governor Spencer Cox here in Utah. Dr. Nye, thanks for being with us.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
And also joining us in our virtual studio is Christine Cooke Fairbanks, who's our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland. Christine, thanks for coming back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Nye, I want to start this conversation by kind of asking a big picture question about education here in Utah. You're, of course, the new advisor to Governor Cox on education. We'll get into some of your background and what you hope to bring to this role and kind of what we should expect in the months and years ahead in Utah on education policy. But first, the big picture question that I think probably comes up a lot when we discuss education policy is just as a casual observer, right? I see education policy debated and discussed in Utah, mostly through the lens of funding. It's always about, well, do we spend enough or not enough? Are we spending money on the right things? And obviously those questions are very important. But it also seems to me that there's a good argument to be made, and this is something that Christine has done some good work on, but the role of parents in their education is also very important. And maybe sometimes that gets missed or undervalued a little bit. So I want to start with the big picture question is, are we focusing on the right things in our education policy debates here in Utah, or do we need to elevate the role of parents in education outcomes for their kids? How would you begin to kind of lay the foundation for our listeners of the way we should be talking about education policy in the state?
I appreciate the question. Where I see the engagement of parents and this prioritization of funding and the funding requests associated with public education, both can be true. And when we think about the funding, we need to ask how is it being spent? And while we might perseverate on that at times, it's still a very valid question, because we want to make sure that whatever we're putting that money to and after, we're receiving services that we would want for our children. And so I see a coupling, if you will, meaning a parent wants to know what type of education their child is receiving. They want to have some assurance that the education that their child is receiving is good and will set them up for success. And part of that is how we allocate our resources to doing just that. And so when I think of the framework and the idea of the parent's role in the education of their children, it's not only just very important, it is the of utmost importance. And thankfully, even in state code right now, we have laws that establish an expectation that the parent is primarily responsible for the education of their child. And that can't go understated or overstated. It just has to be clear. And so I appreciate the question in that, are we focusing too much on funding? Perhaps. And if we do it in the absence of what it means for a child to receive an education that their parents would have to have, then that is a mistake, because we do need to have the parents' interests first and foremost in how we are providing those services to a child.
Christine, I want to get your thoughts, because something Dr. and I just mentioned in state code, and kind of a state focus is, of course, the role of parents directing their children's education. And here at Sutherland, we recently rolled out a new statement of principles on a number of policy areas, one of which is education, and there's a statement in there that kind of parallels that we believe that parents are chiefly responsible for directing the care and education of their children. We'll link to that principles document in our show notes. But Christine, what context would you add? I mean, again, we shouldn't imply that funding doesn't matter. Of course funding matters. But to this point of, do we need to elevate the way we talk about the role of parental involvement, parental engagement with education? Do you kind of see that as something important that needs to happen here in Utah, especially as we look at this upcoming legislative session and education policy in the years to come?
Yeah, so the two issues aren't in contrast. They both exist and they're both important at the same time. And just like we're mentioning that, there's funding, and then the next deeper question is, how is it spent? That's really important. Same thing with parents. So as Dr. and I mentioned, there's a kind of statutory and even constitutional landscape for saying that parents have this role in education. The next question then is, how do they engage? There's a lot of discussion about parents' rights. We've talked about this and written about this in the past as well. Rights come with responsibilities. And so parents also have the responsibility, the obligation to get involved. I think that part of sometimes the issue around pressure on teachers, it comes if you have parents that are expecting too much from teachers and not enough from themselves. And so it's really important to have them kind of understanding what their role is and to get involved there.
So I want to approach things this way, whether we're talking about sort of parental engagement, involvement in education policy, and again, this idea that do we need to elevate the role of parents in our education discussion just as a state and, of course, at the district and local level, but also other kinds of debates or policy discussions we might have about education. I want to ask, and maybe Dr. Nye, going back to you, what do you see as the important education policy discussions that we should be having? I mean, again, parental involvement is one of those variables as we're talking about. What else? What are the big things that you think, okay, and especially in my new role advising Governor Cox on education policy, here are the big questions we need to answer, or the big topics we need to tackle in education policy. What's top of mind for you as you've been feeling out this new role?
So as I consider the role of public education, and as Christina mentioned, there it is very much defined statutorily. Now, as much as we can capture in words, it's not all there, but what is there matters. And so, and I'll even go to code, but 53E, Chapter 2's subsection or Section 201 talks about it is the parent's primary responsibility is the public education of the child. And then the role of public education satisfies three things that I think we need to consider as we identify, again, these lines of code being clearly defined by our legislators as elected officials. But one is, the public education's role is to provide and create or help create the conditions for the success of a child in exercising their rights and liberties, number one. Number two, to create self-sufficiency for that child and their future family. And then three, of course, contributing to the public good. And so when we think about as a state, if we were to even just use that framework and start asking questions around those expectations, then we're able to drive greater specificity into either the funding and how it's allocated, how parents, to tie that piece into it, how parents are engaging to see that they're getting that. And then under that statutory guidelines, in elevating that parent engagement, what does that look like for our state? And I'm sure we'll get into that in just a moment. But in that same line or same section of code, it identifies that, legislators, the state school board, local boards, charter governing boards, the expectation is already set out there that they are to elevate the role of the parent in the education of their child. And so we do, I believe in Utah, we have a great leveled expectation. And now what we're asking ourselves, well, how are we delivering on meeting that expectation?
And I want to dive into that more in a second, but first, I mean, one of the things I also want to mention for our listeners is the background you bring to this role, I think, is really important. Prior to being named as Governor Cox advisor on education, you served as a superintendent of Granite Schools, Ogden School District before that. You were with the State Board of Education before that. Can you talk briefly about what have you learned from your background as a practitioner in education that you want to bring to the table in this role to help advise and influence on policy that, again, maybe can open up some of these opportunities to elevate certain components in Utah in a really meaningful way? What do you draw from in your expertise? You have a PhD in this kind of stuff, so you bring a lot of expertise to the table, but you've been in the trenches in the world of education policy. how do you think that perspective can help enhance the policy level discussions we're having on education here in Utah?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And while I might have that expertise, my first and foremost responsibility and obligation is my role as a father and a husband who have children and have had children go through the public education system, and then couple that with my expertise, right, in terms of what does that bring. And to this new role that I have with the governor's office, and it really is about identifying, as you mentioned, what is occurring, that context, coupling that with the policy-making process, hopefully leads to better policy. And not that I get to make those decisions in a silo. That's not who I am. That's not how I've engaged as a superintendent. But it's identifying, working with parents, again, identifying what it is that they want for their children. And then taking a look and critically analyzing the systems that we've created. And I'm using systems at the macro level of public education in the state of Utah, and answering the question, in what ways are we doing really, really well? And what areas do we have room for improvement? And given the practitioner-oriented sense in that, I bring that to the table for consideration when creating policy and direction for our state.
Christina, I want to ask you, you've written for Sutherland on this idea of education governance and just how education policy is decided and influenced at the state level here in Utah. I want to ask you, number one, can you give our listeners just a brief refresher, almost kind of a civics 101? Here's what education governance looks like here in Utah, obviously with respect to the role that Dr. Nye brings and the role of the governor, but just remind us what the structure is, what governance looks like. And then I want to kind of turn that into, okay, given the structure we have, how do we start to advance some of these ideas we're articulating as far as maybe improving things like parental engagement? But first, give us a refresher of what that looks like, and then let's dive into how that structure can maybe increase the benefit or the capacity to serve the needs of parents and students the way that Dr. Nye is describing.
Yes, and I'll start by saying this is actually really important to understand because in this space, almost everyone has an opinion about education policy because they've had an experience with it. It seems a little less wonky than other areas, but it still can have all this depth. But, the state legislature has the lawmaking power in the state for almost every subject. And so they are the main, I would say, policy-making, law-making body in education. The state constitution says that they have the responsibility to establish and maintain a public education system. That's often understood also as the funding piece. They have to fund that and make sure that is available. The Constitution of the state also creates a state board of education, and they have general control and supervision. And what that's come to mean in terms of, kind of tangible expectations, they create academic standards, statewide assessments and accountability systems, teacher licensure, graduation rates, and things like that. So, and they create rules based often on the statutes from the legislature. The governor's office has less direct policy-making power, not to say that there isn't any. The governor obviously can veto laws, and that's very powerful. Appoints people to the charter school board. That's a board that's created via statute. And as well as having the bully pulpit, which every executive has, which is giving airtime and championing ideas that are important. And then at the local level, you'll have school boards, and they are making decisions like boundaries, teachers' pay, leadership decision, hiring principals and things like that. So approving instructional material. So understanding which lever of government has which responsibilities is really important for getting involved and for understanding where an issue or a question might be best answered.
So with that structure, and Dr. Nye, if you want to say, hey, no, the governor's office has a ton of power to do great things, but give us a sense of the context of how does the governor view the opportunity before us as a state? Again, keep on framing things through this new role that you're in, because you're still relatively new in it. So I'm sure kind of getting your feet wet, so to speak. But again, you bring such a resume to be able to move things forward in a really meaningful way. But that the way that I would maybe think as just a citizen is, well, given the governance structure that Christine just outlined, the way I tend to approach these kinds of things is we have to remind ourselves what that big aspirational principle is that we believe in as Utahns. You've articulated how the state code outlines it. We've talked about how Sutherland's principles document outlines that. How do you view your role and the governor's role as being able to be that, I don't know, visionary in chief of here's what we're striving for with education, and then helping be part of these conversations to make sure that trickles down to the policy mechanics of doing that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And as we're thinking about our own state constitution, right, Article 10, as Christine is referencing, spells that out very, very clearly, who the two constitutional partners for public education are the legislature and state board of education. That rulemaking authority that the state board has the effect of law that governs what occurs. And so for the executive branch in my role, it's about engaging with the State Board of Education. It's engaging with lawmakers, working with the legislature, identifying how that course of that we would like to see for public education could take the direction we would want it to go. With that being said, it's fully recognizable that this role is more one of influence, and by influence bringing context to whatever the discussion may be. And I'd go even one step further. Given some of my background, I would be able to move past the anecdotal in terms of a direction we might want to go and put in what would be more substantive measures, even quantitative effort to substantiate the why behind the what. And as you can imagine, the what in policy is a lot of different things. But it's to make more informed decisions. And so for this role, while and then the governor's role, we're not necessarily passing the laws, although the governor can veto, as has been mentioned. The state board is going to make the rules regarding it. Local boards, while the state might identify what should be taught in the schools, local boards determine how by adopting curricula in that space. And so it's just being able to provide a little bit of context in this role, bring some level of analysis in terms of if to borrow a term, what is the theory of action? What is that logic model? What is the business case behind certain policy? In other words, what is the objective that we're trying to accomplish? And for me to be able to bring that to the narrative will in the end, I believe, produce better policy for our state.
Well, I think that's beneficial because just in general, across the board on any policy issue, I think it's very easy for us as voters, as citizens, to sometimes get frustrated with a particular policy issue and then kind of go to whichever branch or level of entity of government we can think of and say, well, you need to go and fix this in the way that I like. We've seen that at the national level, of course. We've talked a lot about on the show how that can happen at the Supreme Court level. And so I think that kind of civics refresher is really important, just to remind folks of the respective roles of the governor's office, the legislature, the state board, the local school districts, that is the environment in which then we can have conversations about, okay, what are actually the policy levers we can pull to try to make a difference in a positive way for students, for parents, for teachers. And so I want to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to really dive into this idea of the parent-teacher relationship as kind of a theme that we've been teasing out in this discussion, and really try and get at some specific ideas of how to elevate that, how to move that forward. And as we round out the episode, maybe Dr. and I kind of get a preview from you of what's on deck in the coming months and years. What should we be looking for as far as Utah's education trajectory moving forward? So let's take a quick break and continue this conversation with Dr. Rich Nye, who's the Senior Advisor of Education to Governor Spencer Cox, and Christine Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland. We're going to take a really quick break. Stick around. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Rich Nye. He's the Senior Advisor of Education for Utah Governor Spencer Cox, and Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland. We're really going to dive into some of the elements of an education vision or agenda that could be really meaningful here in Utah, especially when it comes to the parent-teacher relationship and how that can impact educational outcomes for kids. But first, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the show on any of the major platforms: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you like to watch your shows and get your media. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button on whichever platform you use. And if you're watching on YouTube and you want to subscribe, make sure you click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, access to all of that and more at defendingideas.org. Dr. Nye, I want to pick up where we left off and really explore this concept of the parent-teacher relationship. And Christine, this is something that you've written about extensively. This is really a priority for us here at Sutherland Institute. And maybe if I can, Christine, I'll start with you, and Dr. Nye, come back to you, this idea of how to strengthen the parent-teacher relationship. And Christine, I want to first get your take on that. Is what would you say is the ideal relationship between kind of the parent-teacher environment in a given school? What are the kinds of things that you would see that can help that to be strengthened? What policy levers or maybe cultural levers? Just how do we strengthen that parent-teacher relationship here in Utah?
I think the ideal is a partnership, and I'm far from being the first person to say that, but you have teachers who are subject area experts. They are professionals in how to teach, and you have parents that are experts in their children and what they need. And together, that's a really powerful partnership to advance the learning and the achievement and everything you need for that individual student. So the idea ultimately is to make that as healthy as possible. We do live in a I guess a moment when sometimes it's a little tense, pitting teachers against parents. Maybe that's less so in the state of Utah. But certainly I think it starts with staying away from the rhetoric as much as possible and to look at each other as that partner. But then any sort of policy that increases shared information and opportunities to engage. There is some distinction about involvement versus engagement. So involvement could be as simple as showing up to a bake sale, but engagement's a little deeper, and really helping with the learning and kind of following up at home and getting involved in constructive ways. Another, I think, important piece of that as well is to understand that parents have the opportunity to guide the education of their child, not an entire classroom, right? So the relationship there is that the teacher has the opportunity to teach that class full of, multiple students and to come up with what works for that classroom. But parents, they have a window in, but for their students. So kind of understanding the overlap, not overstepping, but also kind of appreciating the different roles there.
Dr. Nye, in your time as a practitioner, I mean, again, you ran things at the Granite School District level, you were at Ogden School District. In your time working in the school districts over the years, have you seen parent engagement increase, decrease? Maybe put another way, are parents more engaged in their kids' education today or less engaged than they were in the past? And if you see any trend line, why do you think that is? What's changed in recent years, if it has changed? I
appreciate the question. And qualifying this, it is anecdotal, right? I would love to have something more definitive, even quantitative, to share in this regard. But by observation, I would say parent engagement has increased. And I believe it's this realization around, for the longest time, and if I were to even take one step back, it was, and as a former teacher, I had many parents just drop their children off to the school, or they arrived on the bus and they just said, "We trust you, let's go, take care of our kid." And I'm not saying in that space that that's changed altogether. I will say, though, that there is a greater sense, hopefully, this responsibility in this partnership being, and if I may, maybe even put a finer point to it or an exclamation point behind it, but when a parent and an educator, a teacher, work together to provide for the educational services of a student. They in many ways, literally and figuratively, of course, are hand in hand providing these services to a child. And the reason that's so critical is, as you can imagine, a parent in that relationship is reaching out and essentially partnering in a way that the educator ought to view that, and many do, as a sacred trust. And I use that word sacred intentionally. There can be no greater trust that a parent has in having and turning over, if you will, not completely, clearly. The education of the child is clearly the parent's responsibility. But in those hours of instruction, when that child is at that school, it becomes incumbent upon the educator to provide those services that the parent would want. And so it is a tremendous degree of trust that a parent places in an educator, in the principal, in the staff that serve the child, and of course the teacher. And so that relationship is of paramount importance. So working hand in hand, providing for the education of a child is a sacred trust that the parent places in the hands of an educator.
Dr. Knight, in addition to that, it seems, and both what you and Christine are mentioning, that there's, and Christine's also written a lot about in recent years of kind of this, especially since 2020, just a very elevated increase among parents of involvement, engagement, these kinds of things. I want to see if we can drill down to the policy component, that it seems like, based on your experiences, as you've said, there's more interest among parents of involvement and engagement in their kids' education. And Christine's talked about that, and that's put in the context of a lot of the choice programs that are out there, parents kind of hungry for that kind of level of, I want to be more involved. I want to help direct my kids' education. I need options and different ways to do that. And we've had some good policy advances on that front here in Utah. But I want to ask you, do you see any policy barriers, whether it's from the perspective of the teacher saying, I would love more parental engagement in my classroom with these parents' kids, but there's something standing in the way of that, or if it's parents saying, I would love to be more engaged, but there's something standing in the way. Are there policy barriers? What are the kinds of things that we should be looking at that might benefit from some reform or improvement to strengthen and increase that momentum around parent-teacher partnership and engagement?
Great. So I'll move from the policy to the practitioner, if that's okay. So from the policy perspective, the governance that we have would suggest, as I mentioned before, the State Board of Education as locally elected officials, right, from the local constituents, sets the expectation of what should be taught in a school. And so how to navigate that, if I as a parent have some concerns regarding some state standards, I'm going to need to engage with my state board school member and the state board generally in that regard. Again, the how the state standards are being taught is really left to the local boards, who again are locally elected officials, who for a parent wanting to see something in that space to where, I have some concerns about this curricula, or I'd like to see more of this curricula. That's that level of engagement. And so from the policy aspect, it's knowing where to engage, recognizing first and foremost that engagement needs to occur in the classroom and with the principal and the specific school, and identifying what that level of engagement looks like. And to that, it's always an open invitation. If a parent doesn't feel like they're able to engage in the school in the way that they need to, they ought to, of course, talk with the teacher, talk to the principal, talk to the superintendent or the charter director, the local school board members, and identifying very specifically where that's occurring. Because the expectation, as mentioned before, is parents have every right to engage in the education of their children, and should, to the extent that they would like. So I think the policy's there that establishes the expectation. Again, if there's something in practice that parents experience some roadblocks, I would anticipate it has more to do at a local type level, because we do have the systems, the framework, the expectation, even the guardrails necessary in code or state board rule already to encourage that by way of expectation. The code is clear. When it says shall, That's not a suggestion. That's not a maybe. That's not a maybe, to that end. But it is an expectation that local school systems not only allow it, but encourage it.
Christina, I want to ask you that I know there's some national data, and you can expand on this obviously, but around what teachers want, teachers having an interest in greater parental engagement in the classroom. I think some of the things in particular on things like homework, attendance, behaviors of their kids. I want to kind of ask you sort of big picture and then getting into maybe some granular ideas. It seems like so many of our education debates in recent years have felt really contentious. You alluded to this earlier, that sometimes it feels like just a culture war battle that's pitting parents and teachers against each other. Here in Utah, that I think is less pronounced than in other places. And I think it's because of this. Again, it's in state code. It's built in kind of to the way we approach this, that parents and teachers are in a partnership. But I want to ask you, if teachers are saying, I want more parental engagement in the classroom in some areas, and parents are saying, well, I want to be more engaged in some areas, does it feel like there's still any kind of disconnect between those two desires? And if so, how do we bridge that, whether that's kind of just culturally, socially, or if maybe there are some specific policy levers, even at the local level, like Dr. Nye is alluding to? How do we make sure those two desires can really just match up in a parallel kind of way?
So that data you're mentioning talks about, they want more engagement on homework, attendance, and the behavior, which is interesting. So it's kind of a signal to what is helpful engagement, maybe versus what a parent thinks they need to be doing. I don't know. It would be also interesting, because it is national, to kind of dive into a Utah-specific look at that as well. But I think part of this, it's something that Sutherland has written about, is to increase the shared information. I mentioned a little bit earlier, is to increase access. So engagement has to be doable, it has to be manageable and accessible. Again, this is anecdotal, but in speaking with parents about this issue, it always somehow comes back to time and how much time it takes to get involved. And there is actually a lot of information available. Their standards are public. More teachers are using tech platforms than ever before. The state has a statewide agreement with Canvas, and so more teachers are using that. There's not a mandate necessarily to use it, but more are using it. In fact, the vast majority. And so there are pieces there that are really good, but part of it might be thinking through what makes it more doable for parents, right? So part of the discussion could be incentivizing teachers to tweak and offer access to their classroom or the curriculum that they're using day to day. So, and I say incentives, it might actually just be rewarding teachers that are already doing some of this great work. And then the incentive could work to encourage other teachers that are interested in doing this. So kind of staying away from the mandate. Utah wants to be very sensitive to the workload of teachers. I think that's the right move. If you don't get this right for teachers, you won't get it right in general. But something that looks like that, really kind of this Utah way of balancing different stakeholders' interests and creating an access policy that kind of meets the needs of everybody.
Dr. Nye, how do you respond to that? I'm not asking you to commit to a specific policy intervention. Obviously, there's a thoughtful process for those kinds of things at the state level, but just your initial thoughts of the kinds of things Christine is talking about. Do we just need to make it a little easier for teachers and for parents to have the kind of mutual engagement they want? I mean, is that just kind of a general principle that would be valuable to work into our education policy discussions here in Utah, and then maybe explore the kinds of things that Christine is talking about with incentives or rewards or whatever it is on kind of the teacher-parent side? Just directionally, does that feel like the kind of approach that would fit in well with the kind of education policy discussions you think we need to be having here in Utah?
Yeah, I think, and I know, right, that we are moving in that direction anyway. The question is, how do we accelerate it for the desired outcome and objective of having parent engagement, meaningful parent engagement in providing educational services for children? And so as I think some of the narrative around some of the angst maybe that we're seeing in other states, we're seeing in our own state in some degrees, is sometimes something is presented in class that is concerning to a parent. And I think it's important for for one, a parent to know what the recourse is in that regard and how they work with the school, how they work with the teacher, how they work with the superintendent or local board. And it gets addressed. And I dare say, the vast majority of teachers are trying to do a really good job and provide amazing services to children so they get a high quality education. But every once in a while, there's something that happens that causes us a little pause to ask the question, well, how might we engage differently, and what does, and I'll use the word transparency, look like in terms of what's occurring in the classroom? And so you are seeing a lot of different efforts, even at the strategy level of a teacher, to be able to say, well, I want to make sure my parents know what we're doing in our classroom. So if there are questions, they feel like they can reach out to me. They feel like they can have the conversation with me, and we do have that trust in that relationship. And I think whether it's incentives or just this expectation, you're seeing a lot of teachers, principals, educators in general, who are already going down this road in a good way. The second part of that, or one of the obstacles, is how do we build the capacity of parents in accessing whatever the platform or whether it's Canvas that was mentioned. It's building the capacity of parents to know how to use those tools to understand what is occurring in the classroom. In other words, the teacher can build out a wonderful, transparent syllabus, course program, right, in a learning management system, whatever it may be. But if the parent can't access it, then it's kind of a missed opportunity. And so we need to look at it on two fronts. One, what does it look like for teachers to continue to build up those resources for parents to understand what's going on in the classroom? And then two, building the capacity of the parents on how to know how to access those resources to be well informed.
Christina, I want to make sure if there's anything you want to respond to what Dr. Nye said. I mean, to me, that seemed like a great encapsulation of sort of the shared approach. It's this partnership. And Christine mentioned the Utah way. It just seems like on many policy fronts, there's an approach here in Utah that's a little different. It's a little unique, where we are better equipped, probably still not perfect, of course, but better equipped than a lot of other states to get the right stakeholders around the table and view things as a shared partnership where we can make some of these improvements. It reminds me of what you just said, Dr. Nye, of a statement I always heard from a former boss. A significant part of my early career I worked in PR, in public relations, and one of kind of the maxims that was told to me by a former boss was, in absence of information, people create their own narratives. And so if we can help share some of that information, use the word transparency, if it's viewed as this partnership where we're sharing information with each other because we're partners, trying to create a better future life for our kids, that's a really powerful principle that can kind of create some alignment. So, Christine, I want to ask you if you have any final thoughts on that, and then I want to jump to just some really broad, big picture questions, almost kind of rapid fire as we close out the episode. But, Christine, any final thoughts on the parent-teacher partnership and this vision of advancing it here in Utah in a meaningful way?
I think what Dr. Nye said is right. And, Utah does have a strong family culture. I think people inherently understand the role of parents and that they should be involved. And so that's very encouraging. And the fact that we're headed in that direction is also encouraging. But yeah, how can we make it more robust more quickly? Those are questions that policymakers can tackle. And I think those are the right questions to be asking.
Well, Christine and Dr. Nye, we've got just a couple minutes left, and I want to close off with one just kind of a big picture question for you, Dr. Nye. We talked about a lot here, mostly through the lens of kind of parent-teacher partnership, but what else is on your mind as you're, sort of sinking your teeth into this new role? What are some of the other education priorities you're going to be working on? What's on the governor's mind? Give us kind of a preview of the coming months, maybe the 25 session, and just in the coming years, what are the things that are going to be top priorities or should be top priorities for the education policy landscape here in Utah? Help us get excited about what that future looks like.
I first and foremost believe, as far as what we're trying to accomplish in Utah, we're having the right conversations. We're asking the questions that need to be asked. And part of that is parent engagement, as we've been talking about, that teacher and parent relationship for sure. So you're going to see more of that. And then for me in this role, it's also a priority to elevate the voice of the parents. And so as a superintendent, it's very, very important for me to engage with my communities and identify what's working really, really well with parents and what still might or might be a challenge, or what still needs to be improved in how we're doing things. And I would like to take that to the statewide level, is to say, how are we engaging parents in the policy-making process in a way that they have that vested interest, which all parents should should have in the education of their children. And so when I think of what Utah's doing, there's a lot to get excited about. We're recognized regularly nationally for being able to provide a high-quality education to children. And again, what can also be true is we have room to improve. And so there's a lot of different areas in which to improve. Parent engagement, I think, is one, and that's what we've been talking about today. But what does it also look like in terms of the pathway of a child? So in public education, we'll have a child there for 13 years, 14 if they took pre-K, pre-kindergarten, preschool. But what does it look like in terms of the value proposition that the diploma, that high school diploma, represents in setting children up for post-secondary pursuit success? And so there's alignment there between what does it look like with the Utah system of higher education and public education. So I think maximizing the resources that we have, significant resources are contributed every year out of the statewide budget to this very thing, and just being able to ask those types of questions. How might it be better, while recognizing the things that are going well and should be celebrated? And so you'll see more of that. Legislative session, the interim committees are working through what might be some committee bills, and a lot of effort is going into prioritizing education, while at the same time, I think identifying of all the policies that we're passing, how are we experiencing the return on those? And so one effort would be, obviously, through that policy, is identifying how well our policies are serving us, and being able to take a look in the mirror a little bit to say, how might that be different as well in terms of those regulations or even governance of education? So I could honestly go on and on in terms of what it means for our state. But at the same time, I think we need to understand a little bit more clearly through the parent's voice what we as a state want for the education of our children. And then we get to work in meeting that need.
I love everything about that vision, and it reminds me of a statement from Ian Rowe, who's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Our listeners may remember he's been on this podcast before, but he came out to Utah within the last couple of years for a joint policy forum we did with AEI. And when he was here, he mentioned that people asked him, well, why are you going to Utah to talk about family and faith and education and work and upward mobility and everything? They're doing really well on all those metrics. And he said that the theme of the conference was going from good to great. And so that's kind of the theme I interpret from you is there's a lot of things going really well here in Utah. There's still, of course, a lot of work to be done to improve things. But it's this idea of we're doing a good job. Let's move toward greatness as a state when it comes to education. And Christine, I want to ask for your final thoughts. How do we go from good to great? What ought to be on our education agenda, education vision for the coming months and years here in Utah?
Yeah, you mentioned that we're ranked really high. I mean, number 2 in the state, I think, according to 1. So you'd have to say that we're doing really quite well from an outside perspective. But I think there's always room to ask the question, how are we meeting the unique needs of each student? And that can be accomplished. You can ask that question in public school system, in outside private opportunities. And I think that will continue to be the discussion. Choice, but not kind of the term of art, but just choices and options for families and things like that. So I hope we continue to kind of go down that route and make the best options of all of them that are available.
Well, that is at time. We'll have to have more of these kinds of conversations as things go, especially Dr. and I, as you continue to work on some of these issues. But I want to thank both of you again, Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute, and Dr. Rich Nye, Senior Advisor for Governor Cox over education. Thank you both for lending your time and expertise here on Defending Ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take one final break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there's a few notes that I captured from our conversation with Christine Fairbanks and Rich Nye that I think can help inform our education policy discussions, especially if we find ourselves in a debate with somebody, because we so often talk about education focusing on the funding question, but this principle of parental engagement is actually really important and ought to factor in more to our conversations. So here are kind of the three takeaways from the episode today. Number one, we have to remember this overarching principle that parents are the ones who are chiefly responsible for directing the education of their kids. As Dr. and I mentioned, this is something that's built into state law, and it's also something that's embedded in the Sutherland Institute Statement of Principles, which we've released recently, just emphasizing this point of parents being central to directing the education of their kids. And that means that the second point is that means that our policy debates really ought to elevate this principle at every chance we have. And that means that making it easier for parents to engage in education in the classroom should be a policy priority for all of us. And lastly, we need to make sure we view this as a partnership between parents and teachers, and asking the question of how do we make it easier for parents, for teachers, to be able to share information and share this responsibility together in a partnership of educating our kids and preparing them for adulthood. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. We hope you enjoyed this discussion, that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. I want to remind you, if you liked what you heard on this episode, please subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, any of the major platforms. Wherever you like to get your shows, make sure you search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, click the bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. And if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, and if you want to see more conversations like this, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's it for this episode. Thanks for being with us from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.